Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Language Arts Gallery. Today, we're going to continue with our academic writing and research course, and we're going to talk about positionality and reflexivity in the research process. So, we're going to define these two terms. We're going to talk about how, as researchers, we identify what influences us and what in turn influences our research. We're going to talk about the language and the structure for positionality statements. And at the end of our lesson, you're going to draft a short positionality statement for your own research. So let's get started with a quick warm-up. I want you to think about the topic that you're researching. And if you're not currently researching a topic, I want you to think about something that you're interested in researching. Think about why you chose it and what makes it significant to you. This is different than the significance that you're going to include in your introduction, where you're talking about the significance of the problem and the significance of your study. No, we're not talking about how you're contributing to the literature. Why do you want to study this, right? What is it that makes it special to you? So you can go ahead and pause me and you can reflect on that for just a moment. So now let's talk about positionality. Positionality refers to your identity, your background, and your perspective, and how it relates to the topic you're studying, the participants in your study, and the research process. It answers the question, who are you in relation to the research that you're doing? So, why do you think the audience would be concerned about a researcher's positionality? Why would that matter? Well, first of all, depending on how you're related to the participants, and I don't mean how you're related as being a blood relative, but what position this occupies in your life, this is going to influence how you see this problem, how you see a research setting, how you see the participants in the research study. And all of these things can lead to bias. So, in what types of studies would this be especially important? Well, I think if we're doing a study where it's, for example, a highly quantitative study where researcher bias is not going to play a large role, then this would be less important. If we're doing some type of ethnographic study where we are embedding ourselves in a research setting, then it's going to be more important. Remember, when we talk about things like ethnography, it's impossible for us as researchers to remove ourselves from the setting. We become part of that setting. And with that, so do our biases. Now I want to talk about reflexivity. So reflexivity is the way that we deal with our attitude towards the particular topic, the subjects, the setting, and it's an ongoing process. We examine our values, our identity, our experiences, and how this can influence the research we're doing. And I love this statement. Think of it as self-awareness within the research process. So when we think about reflexivity, then how is this related to positionality? And I just kind of gave you a pretty good clue here. So reflexivity is something you're constantly doing as a researcher. And it's often a very private experience. You're often doing it on your own. Positionality is something you're sharing with the audience. It's a more public display. So as we engage in the process of reflexivity, our identity can shift, right? Because we're becoming aware of who we are, how we view things, what our biases are. And with that, that can impact our positionality. So, talking about this, talking about positionality, and we're going to talk about drafting a positionality statement in a moment. Why do we even do this? We've got our research methods section, either in our article or perhaps an entire chapter within our dissertation. Why would we bother to write a positionality statement? Well, first of all, as I said, it can impact our biases, right? So that's going to add transparency to the research process when we acknowledge that, when we acknowledge our position on a particular topic. With that, we become more credible in the eyes of our readers. As I said, we acknowledge our potential bias. And if we're doing qualitative or social research, this is very important. I talked about the importance of doing this in an ethnographic setting. So why would it be so important in qualitative and social research? Well, as I just mentioned, if you're doing a highly quantitative research, a highly quantitative study where researcher bias is less of an issue, then drafting a positionality statement becomes less important. But if you're doing a qualitative study, if you're involved in the setting, if you're positioning yourself within the research setting, then it's really important for you to discuss your views, how you're influenced by this research, who you are as a person. I think particularly important when we're doing observation, even if we're taking steps to mitigate against potential bias, doing things like using an observational checklist, we still need to acknowledge our position relative to the research. So now talking about elements of positionality, what exactly does positionality include? Well, it includes our cultural background, our gender identity, our socioeconomic class. This is really, really important. Our educational background, our political beliefs, if they're relevant, and our relationship to the community that we're studying. Just to go back and give an example here, if you're a highly educated person and you're studying people who have no formal education, you might be biased. You might think, I spent 10 years after high school getting 3 degrees. So I believe higher education is really important. So you might hold biases towards that population. So it's important to acknowledge those. So where does this statement of positionality appear in academic writing? Very often it's in the introduction. It may also appear in the method section, and that could be either in our article or a dissertation. And towards the end of this lesson, I'm going to talk about times when you're going to want to avoid including a statement of positionality, even if you're doing a highly qualitative study. So I've talked about positionality and I've talked about its relationship to biases. So are they really exactly the same? No, they're not. Positionality is where we acknowledge how our views can be influenced. Bias is unacknowledged distortion of whatever it is we're presenting. So reflexivity helps to mitigate against bias in the research process. That's why it's important that we're constantly reevaluating who we are in relationship to the research. So, different ways that we can start a statement of positionality. And these are just some stock phrases. Feel free to use these. These are not phrases that anyone owns that you need to cite. These are phrases that you can use in your own positionality statement. And this is where you're going to include some aspect of your identity. As an expatriate teacher teaching in South Korea, my interest in this topic stems from. Here you're going to talk about experience, about personal experience, and what's driven you to study this topic. I acknowledge that my background in whatever experience you've had may influence your approach or your how you view certain aspects of this study. I acknowledge that my background in educational policy may influence my attitude towards the effectiveness of these policies. So using those phrases, those stock phrases as sentence starters, what sort of tone should we take with our positionality statement? Well, we want our positionality statement to be formal because we are including this either in our research article or a dissertation. But we still want to include a personal element. We're trying to share with our audience who we are as the researchers. So it's really important. But because we're being formal, because we're sharing who we are, we want to remain limited to a formal approach to what influences us within this research process. We're not making an emotional appeal to our audience here. Now, writing in the first person, you're going to hear different approaches and different opinions on this. And the real answer is it depends. Some people will encourage you to write positionality statements in the first person simply because it makes it more personal. You're writing about yourself. Others will encourage you to write in the third person, the researcher, because we avoid first person pronouns generally in academic writing. We do not write from a first person perspective. The real answer is whatever your advisor tells you or whatever the guidelines are for that particular journal. So that's how I would approach that. And again, you don't want to go off, and this is in line with avoiding emotional appeals. You don't want to use this as a soapbox and go off in one direction that's entirely unrelated to your research. People are interested in reading your article for the research that you're doing. So keep whatever your positionality statement is and what it includes relevant to the research that you're doing. So let's look at some more stock phrases and language examples here before we look at a basic positionality statement. And then we're gonna work on expanding this a little bit to include reflexivity. My personal experience with led me to. I recognize that my role as a what influences. I recognize that my role as a school principal or as an administrator or a superintendent. Because of my background in, I'm particularly sensitive to. Because of my background in refugee student education, I'm particularly sensitive to how refugee students are treated in their approach to scholarly writing. So here's an example here. As a first generation university student from a rural background, I bring a personal understanding of the educational barriers faced by similar communities. This experience shaped my decision to study policy interventions in rural education. Now, again, this is written in the first person, which is fine if that journal and if your advisor will allow you to create positionality statements in the first person. And I think it's also important to note that at times you will see positionality statements when you're writing a thesis or a dissertation as a separate section outside of those 5 chapters. It might be an appendix, it might be something that precedes the first chapter. So you may see this as a separate section, in which case your advisor may encourage you to write it in the first person. But again, it's specific to whatever your advisor tells you. So let's look at a few more examples, and we're going to look at how different elements of people's identity can influence the positionality statements that they draft. So this first one is based on cultural background. Growing up in a multilingual Ethiopian household, I developed an interest in language policy. This personal history shaped the focus of my research on multilingual education. Now, this is really important. This notion of being an insider or an outsider, I think really important when we talk about ethnography. Although I am not a member of the community, although I'm not a member of the community I studied, I spent 6 months building trust and learning local customs. This outsider perspective allowed me to observe with fresh eyes, but also required increased sensitivity. Now, take note of the fact that we are not addressing reflexivity at this point. We're just talking about who we are in relationship to the research. We're going to talk about how we can mitigate against our biases in just a moment. Now, moving on to political and social identity. As a feminist scholar, I approach the interviews with an awareness of gender dynamics in the workplace. This influenced both the questions I asked and how I interpreted the responses. So, some do's and don'ts of our positionality statement. Do connect your identity to the research topic. That's what we want to do. That's the purpose of this positionality statement. Do acknowledge limitations. Talk about how this might limit your ability to carry out the research. Remember, we just did a video on assumptions and limitations, and we talked about how every study has limitations. Don't share irrelevant personal details. It's not an autobiography or a memoir. You're simply talking about who you are and how that connects to the research. And don't make it overly emotional and don't make it informal. Even though you're showing who you are, it is still part of a formal research article or dissertation. So now let's talk about this three-part structure. We've really talked about the first two, which is who you are and how it connects to your research. Now we're going to bring in this notion of reflexivity. How are you managing this? So I want you to think about your own research. What personal background, what academic experiences led you to this topic? How does this background shape how you're interpreting the data? And finally, this is where reflexivity comes in. What steps are you taking to reduce this bias? So let's look at two examples. And I think these are two great ways that each of these researchers practices reflexivity. As someone who has worked in public hospitals in Ethiopia, I became interested in healthcare accessibility. My professional background may influence how I interpret policy effectiveness. To manage this, I triangulated interview data with government reports. So as we look at this section right here, to manage this, okay, that's the element of reflexivity that we want to share with our readers and how we took steps to manage our biases. The next one, coming from a pastoralist community, I have firsthand knowledge of rural mobility patterns. This shaped my decision to study how educational policies affect nomadic children. I maintained reflexivity by keeping a journal during fieldwork. Okay, and that's a great way to help mitigate against potential biases. So, what are we going to do then if we feel we're really not connected to the research? A lot of people study things that they're passionate about. Some people study things that they think they can finish. They just want to get their project done. They want to get their publication. Maybe it's something their professor or their chair is doing. And you know what? Maybe it's just a project they thought they could finish to get their degree. So, if possible, use your academic background or your research interest. Although I have no personal connection to the refugee experience, my background in international law motivated my focus on resettlement policy. So remember, and I talked about this earlier, positionality is not about oversharing. It enhances our transparency, our credibility, and good statements of positionality are reflective, they're relevant, and they're well structured. And we talked about that three-step structure. Now, some notes on what to do if we feel we should not include a statement of positionality. So it might not be necessary, and I said this earlier, if you're doing a highly quantitative study where your influence is really minimal. And also, very important, be mindful of the journal guidelines, and also always listen to your advisor. Follow whatever they tell you to do. If a journal tells you this prohibits personal commentary, you might be prohibited from including or sharing a statement of positionality. If you submit your article, you might get a revise and resubmit. They might say you need to remove this. So. Okay, so now some things that you can reflect on. I want you to think about who you are, and this is your identity and your background, your experiences, why you've chosen this topic for research. And if you haven't chosen your topic yet, think about a topic you might be interested in. Why are you interested in it? How might you be biased? How might who you are, your identity, how might that interact with how you carry out this process and how you view people who take part in this process? And how are you managing this? Okay, so you can use all that to draft your statement of positionality. All right, great work. Thank you so much for joining us for another great lesson at the Language Arts Gallery, and I'll see you all in our next video.